In the annals of the Second World War, amidst the thunder of cannons and the roar of Spitfires, a quieter, yet profoundly impactful, battle was waged. This is the story of how British ingenuity, resilience, and a dash of dry humour turned the airwaves into a weapon, subtly dismantling Nazi ideology within the hearts and minds of German prisoners of war held on British soil. It's a testament to the power of truth, delivered with characteristic British resolve, proving that some victories are won, not with bullets, but with broadcasts. It was a blustery autumn afternoon in late 1943, the kind that whipped across the Yorkshire Dales, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant peat fires. At Camp 17, nestled discreetly near the village of Grassington, the wind rattled the corrugated iron barracks and whistled through the barbed wire fences. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the muted murmur of German voices, a constant low hum that spoke of rigid discipline and an unyielding loyalty to the fatherland, even in captivity. The temperature hovered just above freezing, a typical British chill that seemed to seep into one's bones. The strategic situation was clear. Controlling the morale and information flow to these prisoners was paramount. The enemy's propaganda machine, honed to a terrifying efficiency, had instilled in these men a fervent belief in Nazi ideology, a belief that conventional methods of managing prisoners had failed to dislodge. British attempts at re-education through lectures and carefully curated newspapers had largely fallen on deaf ears, met with a wall of suspicion and ingrained dogma. The dilemma was stark. These German prisoners maintained their rigid discipline, resisting British influence with an almost fanatical zeal, remaining loyal to a regime that was, even then, beginning to crumble. Reports filtered back to London of continued Nazi indoctrination among the prisoners, of clandestine meetings, and the chilling risk of organized resistance within the camps. This was not merely about keeping men locked up, it was about preventing a potential fifth column, a breeding ground for future conflict right on British soil. Enter Major Alistair Finch, a man in his late 40s with a perpetually rumpled tweed jacket and an intelligence officer's keen, observant eyes. He'd seen enough of the world to know that brute force rarely changed minds. Alongside him was Captain Eleanor Vance, a sharp, no-nonsense BBC liaison officer in her early 30s, whose background in public information had given her a unique insight into the power of communication. They were a curious pair, often found huddled over maps and reports in Finch's drafty office, fueled by endless cups of strong tea. Their motivation was simple: to find a way to penetrate the ideological armor of these men. Finch, a veteran of the Great War, understood the psychological toll of conflict. Vance, a civilian thrust into military service, understood the power of narrative. Their radical proposal to use radio broadcasts as a tool for psychological warfare was initially met with a healthy dose of skepticism from the military hierarchy. "Radio to German prisoners? Are you quite mad, Finch?" barked General Montgomery's aide during one particularly frosty meeting. "They'll only listen to their own propaganda if they listen at all." The prevailing view was that prisoners were to be contained, not engaged in a battle of wits via the airwaves. Conventional channels had indeed failed. Proposals for more direct re-education programs were rejected as too costly, too risky, or simply too un-British in their overt manipulation. The authorities remained deeply skeptical, fearing security breaches or worse, providing the enemy with a platform. But the devastating situation demanded action. The continued reports of Nazi indoctrination, the failed attempts at re-education, the palpable tension within the camps, all pointed to a ticking time bomb. Finch and Vance argued passionately that the enemy's propaganda thrived in an information vacuum. If the Germans were only hearing their own distorted truth, they would never question it. The only way to counter it was to introduce an alternative, a factual, consistent narrative that would, over time, erode their certainties. After months of lobbying, of presenting meticulously researched arguments, of facing down bureaucratic inertia with quiet, persistent determination, a grudging approval was finally granted, not for a full-blown re-education program, but for a controlled experiment. The decision to allow controlled radio access, albeit with strict monitoring and carefully selected programming, marked a tentative yet pivotal shift in strategy. The airwaves, previously silent save for the wind, were about to become a battleground. The real conditions under which the radio project began were, to put it mildly, challenging. Camp 17's barracks, hastily constructed and designed for containment rather than comfort, became the unlikely stage for this audacious experiment. Improvised speaker systems, cobbled together from salvaged parts and requisitioned equipment, were installed in the communal areas. The limited broadcasting equipment, often temperamental and prone to interference, was housed in a small, damp hut near the camp's perimeter. Guards, initially skeptical and wary, were tasked with monitoring prisoner reactions, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Every day that passed meant more deeply entrenched Nazi beliefs, more risk of post-war problems, and a greater challenge to the fragile peace that Britain hoped to build. The challenges were manifold. Technical limitations were a constant headache. The signal often faded, the speakers crackled, and the wiring, exposed to the relentless British weather, frequently shorted. Material scarcity was another hurdle. Rationed electricity meant broadcasts could only occur for limited periods, and spare parts for the temperamental radios were almost impossible to come by. The environmental challenges were ever present. The damp, the cold, the wind, all conspired against the delicate electronics. Human challenges were perhaps the most significant. Prisoner resistance was expected, with many initially refusing to listen, turning their backs, or even attempting to sabotage the speakers. Guard skepticism, too, had to be overcome. Many saw it as a waste of time, a soft approach to hardened enemies. Organizationally, the military bureaucracy remained a formidable opponent, constantly raising concerns about security, cost, and the perceived coddling of the enemy. Major Finch and Captain Vance, however, were not easily deterred. They worked long hours, often through the night, setting up the systems, troubleshooting technical glitches, and meticulously planning the broadcast schedule. Their resilience under adversity was remarkable. When a speaker failed, Finch would be there, screwdriver in hand, muttering about bloody German engineering, even as he fixed the British-made component. Vance, with her innate ability to improvise, would find creative solutions when resources failed, often charming supplies out of reluctant quartermasters. British dry humour was their constant companion. "I do hope they appreciate the BBC's classical music hour, Alistair," Vance once quipped, sharing a precious tea ration with Finch during a particularly frustrating evening. "Might civilize them a bit." The shared tea, the quiet jokes, the camaraderie amongst the small team all helped to boost morale in the face of overwhelming odds. The personal sacrifice was considerable. Finch spent countless nights monitoring prisoner reactions, his sleep often disturbed by the distant murmur of German voices or the sudden silence that indicated a broadcast was having an effect. Vance's relationships outside the camp were strained by her obsessive focus on the project, her dedication unwavering. The themes of resilience under adversity, the importance of improvisation, and the often unseen cost of innovation were woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Yet, the unity across ranks, from the officers to the guards who slowly began to understand the project's potential, grew stronger with each small success. The initial operational phases were fraught with setbacks. Equipment failures were common, and prisoners, as predicted, initially refused to listen, some even attempting to sabotage the speakers by stuffing rags into them or cutting wires. But the team adapted. Speakers were strategically positioned where prisoners could not avoid hearing them, in mess halls and recreation areas. Vance meticulously selected specific BBC programs, News bulletins detailing Allied victories, carefully vetted accounts of Nazi atrocities being revealed as Allied forces advanced, and powerful excerpts from Churchill's speeches translated and delivered with gravitas. The operation was progressing, albeit slowly, like a stubborn plough breaking new ground. Success was far from guaranteed, but the seed had been planted. The airwaves, once a source of enemy propaganda, were now carrying a different kind of message, a quiet, persistent whisper of truth. This chapter marked the turning point, the moment when the quiet hum of the radio began to produce tangible, perceptible results. Intelligence reports, initially filled with cynical observations, began to show anomalies. Prisoner behavior was subtly changing. Conversations overheard by guards, meticulously recorded and translated, revealed German soldiers questioning the narratives they had been fed for years. "Did you hear that bit about Stalingrad?" one might whisper. The BBC said it was a complete rout, not a strategic withdrawal. Requests, initially hesitant, began to surface. "Could we hear more of the news, please?" The camp's rigid Nazi hierarchy, once an impenetrable wall of dogma, began showing cracks. Senior German officers, still clinging to their ingrained beliefs, tried desperately to maintain control, issuing stern warnings against listening to enemy lies. But they could not prevent the broadcasts from reaching the ears of their men. The conflict of doctrines was stark and undeniable. Rigid Nazi indoctrination, built on a foundation of carefully constructed myths and selective information, was now confronted by the undeniable truth of Allied victories being broadcast daily. The German officers, accustomed to their own crude propaganda, had presumed British broadcasts would be equally unsophisticated and easily dismissed. Instead, they encountered factual reporting, eyewitness accounts, and undeniable evidence of events unfolding on the eastern and western fronts. Some, of course, dismissed the reports as blatant lies, a desperate attempt by the British to sow discord. But others, particularly the younger soldiers, could not ignore the consistency and detail of the BBC's reporting. The German observers themselves became a fascinating study. There was Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a Luftwaffe officer captured after his Messerschmitt was shot down over Kent. Initially defiant, he began to question what he had been told, his face a mask of perplexity as he listened to reports of German cities being bombed, reports that contradicted the official line of invincibility. Then there was young Private Hans Müller, barely 18, who secretly listened intently, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding. Senior officers, once united in their contempt for their captors, now debated amongst themselves, their voices hushed, their arguments often ending in frustrated silence. The seeds of doubt had been sown. The first direct engagement, where the operation demonstrated its profound effectiveness, occurred on a cold morning in April 1945. The BBC announced a special broadcast: the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. As the broadcast began, describing in chilling detail the horrors discovered by advancing British troops, the emaciated bodies, the piles of dead, the unspeakable suffering, the entire camp fell silent. Every prisoner, from the most hardened SS officer to the youngest conscript, stopped talking. The clatter of mess tins ceased. The shuffling of feet halted. The silence was profound, heavy with the weight of truth confronting ideology. The voice from the radio, calm and measured, painted a picture of unimaginable depravity, a stark contrast to the glorious vision of the Reich. Even the most dedicated Nazi officers, their faces pale and drawn, could not speak. Some prisoners, their eyes fixed on nothing, began to weep, quiet sobs echoing in the sudden stillness. Others sat in stunned disbelief, their world crumbling around them. The British guards, watching from their posts, maintained their professional composure, but even they felt the immense gravity of the moment, the palpable shift in the air. This was how truth became the most potent weapon. This was how information, maintained and delivered strategically, could shatter indoctrination. The contrast between the BBC's factual reporting and the enemy's propaganda was laid bare. The chapter ended with the enemy, the Nazi ideology within the prisoners, comprehending that it faced a challenge it could not counter: undeniable truth. The airwaves had done what no amount of barbed wire or armed guards could achieve. As the war finally drew to a close in May 1945, the profound impact of the radio operation became undeniably clear. The atmosphere in Camp 17, and indeed across many other camps where similar initiatives had been cautiously implemented, was one of victory achieved not through brute force, but through resilience, innovation, and a deep psychological insight into the human mind. The celebration was restrained, a quiet, almost British sense of relief that the struggle to reach minds through the fog of propaganda had, against all odds, succeeded. The lasting consequences transcended the immediate military context. Assessments revealed that a significant number of prisoners had been successfully denazified, their perspectives irrevocably changed by the consistent stream of factual information. Many returned to Germany not as indoctrinated fanatics, but as individuals grappling with a new, often painful understanding of their nation's crimes. This contribution to post-war reconstruction was immeasurable. These former prisoners, having heard the truth from an impartial source, became advocates for rebuilding a democratic Germany, some even becoming key figures in denazification efforts. Their personal testimonies powerful tools against lingering Nazi sympathies. The operation proved that collaboration between military intelligence, the armed forces, and media organizations like the BBC could function at an unprecedented scale, achieving objectives far beyond conventional warfare. The fate of the protagonists, Major Alistair Finch and Captain Eleanor Vance, reflected the quiet nature of their victory. Finch continued in intelligence roles for a few years, applying the lessons learned about psychological operations to the nascent Cold War. Vance, after a brief stint helping establish the BBC's German service, returned to civilian life, her extraordinary contribution never publicly recognized because the psychological warfare aspects of the operation remained partially classified for decades. Yet some received quiet recognition from grateful German civilians years later, former POWs who sought out the British officers who had, in their words, opened their eyes. The themes of historical legacy and the importance of forgotten heroes resonated deeply. It was only when documents were declassified decades later that the full scope of the operation became known, validating the immense power of truth and information when applied with determination. Historians, sifting through archived reports, researching primary documentation, and interviewing the last surviving British officers and German former POWs, began to piece together the story. The operation was reintegrated into the national historical narrative as a primary example of British psychological warfare innovation, a testament to the nation's capacity for ingenuity under duress. The chapter concludes with a final reflection. The operation proved something fundamental about the human capacity to confront seemingly impossible challenges. It demonstrated that breaking through ideological indoctrination was possible, and that individuals could emerge from such an experience not just having survived, but having prospered with a new understanding. Ordinary individuals, British officers, BBC staff, even the camp guards, did extraordinary things. The nation demonstrated a resilience and innovative thinking that became part of its national identity. An innovation born of necessity to win not just a military victory, but a moral one. The moment when every German POW stopped talking, confronted by undeniable truth, represented more than just psychological warfare success. It represented the enduring power of truth over propaganda, of facts over ideology, and of the human capacity to recognize reality even when it shatters everything previously believed. Fancy delving deeper into the untold stories of British ingenuity and resilience during Wave 2. hit that subscribe button and join our community. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What other hidden gems of history would you like us to uncover? Let's keep these vital narratives alive together.